Moving on from what our reporters in Europe are hearing about the January transfer window, we've got two nerds in America to discuss how data can perhaps improve teams' decision-making in January. I'm Ryan O'Hanlon, joined by Bill Connelly. To start, Bill, I think we both use a lot of data in our writing for team assessment, player assessment, but we ultimately want to use it to sort of get a better handle on decision-making, how teams can make better decisions. And more broadly, how do you think of the January transfer window? Is it a place to avoid at all costs? Is it a place to find value? How do you see it?
Well, I mean, right out front, obviously it's a good time to account for injuries that have happened over the first half of the season, filling holes, things like that, short-term solutions. You can absolutely, I think, find some value there. But really, it just comes down to, do you know what you're doing or not? Like Liverpool got Virgil van Dijk in the January window. That worked out relatively well. But then Barcelona went and just had money, burning a hole in their pocket, and went out and spent 130 whatever on Coutinho a few years ago too. So really, it just comes down to: are you showing patience? Did you maybe not quite get deals done over the summer, and now you have everything in line? That works out pretty well. But if you're really just looking to light money on fire, you can do that too. It probably won't work out as well.
Yeah, it's funny mentioning Coutinho, who also moved to Liverpool in January.
That's right. That's right.
So both one of the worst and best January transfers ever. And I think the reason why, historically, if you try to compare deals across both windows, January transfers for similar players cost around 20% more than they do in the summer. And I think that's because, right, like most teams in professional leagues in Europe have something they're playing for at this point. They're either trying to avoid relegation, they're trying to qualify for Europe, or they're trying to win the league. Yep. So you have like a very small subset of teams in Europe, at least, that can afford to lose their best players, basically. And since that's the case, and like you said, there are teams that have like urgent needs all of a sudden with injuries, or they find themselves lower in the table or higher in the table than they thought. I think January ends up being way more of a seller's market than a buyer's market. And, you look at the data for what actually you get for signings in January. I recently wrote a piece about this. You find a correlation of per $20 million spent, an increase in 0.05 points over the rest of the season. So if you spend $400 million on transfer fees, you would average an increase of 1 point in January.
I mean, that's something, I guess. I'm curious, by the way, if we've got more teams involved in potentially making the Champions League knockout rounds, including, the PSVs of the world, the Portuguese clubs in a given year, I'm curious what that means, because, that's usually where the big clubs go to land up and comers, especially. And if they really think they can make a lot more money making it a couple rounds into the Champions League knockouts, curious what effect that has. It has, Enzo Fernandez was, Benfica was amazing in the Champions League in the first half of that season, and they sold him anyway. So maybe it doesn't make a difference.
Well, yeah, those teams have to balance, right? Like the fact that they can get more for their players probably in January than they would in the summer. And you add in the fact that we don't even know what European leagues are going to have 5 teams in the Champions League next year. So all these other teams can convince themselves that maybe we're going to get the 5th team, and maybe, we're currently in 8th, maybe we can qualify. So I wonder if that will suppress some movement. But all that said, you can still find ways to improve your team in January, even if it's not likely. So let's quickly touch on the teams in the title race in the Premier League. If there's we want to start with Liverpool. You look at Liverpool. Do you see any immediate needs for a team that seems to be getting better with each week?
Right. I would struggle with the idea of messing with anything right now if I'm Liverpool, because things are working pretty well. Like you've mentioned, obviously they need a long-term left-back solution. Andy Robertson is still really good on one end of the pitch, but is increasingly less good on the other. And so if you're looking at an Anthony Robinson or somebody else within the Premier League, especially if you can get that guy, then I would say you do it, but I don't know that you can right now, especially if even Fulham are playing for something in terms of, a spot in Europe next year. So I don't know if that's available. They're not going to panic. This isn't a panic club. But if that is available, that would be the first place I look. I know you talked about a holding midfield as well.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan Gravenberch has suddenly become one of the most indispensable players in the league after not playing all that much last year. But we have seen Wataru Endo contribute to a really good team in the Premier League last year. So maybe he'll eventually gain the trust of his coach, even though he's barely played. So they seem well set for the rest of this season. I think going beyond this season, there's a ton that's probably going to have to be done potentially. But for a team that signed one player, and I don't even know if Federico Chiesa exists anymore. It seems unlikely that they're going to do anything irrational in January. Yep. But another team that perhaps might need to do something is Arsenal, who one of the best, if not the best defensive teams in the world, probably the best team at set pieces in the world. But from open play, by basically any metric, you want fancy metrics like expected goals, you want basic metrics like goals. We're just an average Premier League team. And their best player, in my opinion, the most important player, Bukayo Saka, is out. It seems like until at least March, perhaps longer. Who knows? So they both need, I think, an immediate replacement for Saka. They need someone that can play for Saka so he doesn't keep getting injured in the future. And they also just need better attackers, I think, to improve their attack.
I think from a number standpoint, we're both in love with a certain winger from Brentford who I've written about a couple times. You've written about a couple times. He keeps coming up in the data. And if Brentford isn't playing for anything right now, it almost feels like they're one of the ones who aren't playing for anything right now in the Premier League. Just they're safe, but they're not looking at top 5, 6, 7. Bomo seems like a great addition if you can pull him away. Arsenal obviously has the money to do so, but it seems like he'd be a guy who he's not the most versatile player in the world, but he can still, I think, play a role. And what we've seen this year is Odegaard, Saka. That is anything good that happens in open play requires both of them. They're going to need something in that regard on the right side.
Yeah, and Bomo is sort of the classic player who, like, maybe his stats don't stand out in one particular category, but when you add up all of the things he does, he looks incredible. He's the right age. And I do think Brentford are the team that, of any team in the league, they're going to understand the dynamics of this market, where they stand. They're going to have a realistic expectation of how good their team is, where they finish. And I think they're probably aware of the fact that relegation isn't likely. Europe also isn't likely. And, maybe you can get 70 million for your player instead of 50 or 80 or something like that. And I think for Arsenal, he can play on the right wing, but then he can also play anywhere else in the front three when Saka is back. Yeah. So I think he would be a good fit if a big money move like that could happen. The other potential title chaser, Chelsea, if he can't make it work with this massive squad, I don't know what to tell you.
No, I mean, this is kind of a, roll up the newspaper and just like, no. They'd have too many players already. I think they could absolutely upgrade in midfield a little bit, or at least add depth in midfield. And, left back, some people love Cucurella, others not so much. You could probably upgrade there either way, but you just can't. You have too many players. You spent too much money already. You took 2 years building this squad to see what it could do. So now you have to just see what it can do. It seems like it can do quite a bit right now.
Yeah, and I think they're given preseason expectations. They're very likely to finish top 4. A title race is a title win is just, in my opinion, is not very likely, and as we've seen over the past couple of games, they weren't as good as their point total. So I think hanging on to the team now and maybe trying to make changes along the fringes.
And here's where they spend 200 million on Osimhen or something, just because yes, it seems to be what they do.
Yeah, Nico Jackson having a good season just somehow will be enough to convince them they don't need another striker.
No.
So before we get out of here, anyone else beyond the title race that stands out to you? I know Nottingham Forest are sort of a beloved team of yours. Anything stand out there? Any other clubs that come to mind for you?
Well, I am really curious what Forest and Bournemouth convince themselves they can do. Obviously, one of those two clubs is much more open to writing big checks than the other. Bournemouth has built a little smarter than Forest did. Forest just threw as much money as possible out there, got as many players as possible, desperately tried to hold on for a couple of years, and then held on, and now they're good. I'm really curious what they think they can do. It'll tell us a lot about whether they're really aiming for top 5 in Champions League or whether they're just hoping to get, a Conference League bid or something. But no, it's going to be interesting to see what they do, what the desperate rich clubs do, the Spurs and the Uniteds of the world as well. But like I said, if you're well run, you'll probably do fine in January. But not all those clubs are well run.
Yeah, we didn't think Nottingham Forest were well run. We didn't think Chelsea were, but their both strategies seem to at least be paying off this year. Quickly touching on the big clubs, I think Man City, we almost don't even need to talk about it. They need like as many midfielders as possible. And in my opinion, Tottenham, just a pretty bad injury crisis, but I think that they could make a late season run, but they do seem kind of stuck in that middle zone where it's not worth taking the risks in January, just kind of accept that it's probably a lost season already and move on. And I think that's doubly true for Manchester United. They're worse than Tottenham. They're lower in the table. They don't like getting an immediate improvement in January, spending an extra 30 million on a guy that you could get for cheaper in the summer doesn't make any sense. That said, I'm not going to put my money on them not doing that. So go do anything, Manchester United, even though we know you're going to.
Hey, Bruno Fernandes, he was a January signing, so you never know.
That's true, as was Wout Weghorst, I believe. So, the yin and the yang.